Hi there, welcome everyone to the latest episode of the Our Creative Connection podcast. I am delighted to welcome Danelle, Lee and Paul Cooke from the University of Leeds into conversation today. We're going to be talking about Project Create, which is their work involving young people in arts-based mental health research. And I was a part of one of their activities as well, so I think we'll touch on that. We will definitely just have a conversation broadly about creative health. What does that mean? Why is that important? And all the good things, really. So welcome, Danelle. Welcome, Paul. It's great to have you on the show.
Great.
Thanks very much for inviting us. It's really lovely to be here and to see you again, Chris, in your other role. We've seen you as the creative practitioner. It's really good to see you as a TV or as a podcast presenter.
Whatever this is. Yeah. Well, I think I kind of got into this just because I felt like I was having loads of really good conversations with people. And partly because my brain is just going, I was like, oh God, I'm going to forget that. Maybe we should start recording these things. And then there were so many cool things coming out. I was like, I need to share that, with other people. So that's how it all sort of came about, really. Sort of the accidental podcaster, I guess. Could you introduce a little bit about Project Create and how it came about, and what's the backstory to it? Could you tell the listeners a little bit about yourselves and Project Create?
Shall I start off by doing the kind of genesis of it, because I was there first, and then I'll pass over to you, Danelle, to talk about kind of youth engagement side of it, maybe.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So I'm Paul Cooke. I'm actually a professor of world cinemas at the University of Leeds. But the last sort of 10, 15 years, I've been involved in a whole range of different participatory arts programs, particularly around using participatory video. So I've done lots of that kind of stuff. And via my engagement on a whole range of projects, I basically get involved with people at Leeds working in psychology. And they were really interested in the way I was using participatory art as a kind of tool for, I suppose, making sure that the voices of participants were rooted at the center of any project. So what I basically do is use filmmaking primarily as a way of creating communications about projects, by making sure that those communications are driven by the participants. So you can't budge. So you basically have to make sure that the voices of participants are absolutely front and center to the project. So I was involved in a big project called Attune, which is still running, which is looking at the impact or the potential of creative practices to support young people suffering from multiple adverse childhood experiences, something called ACEs, which seems like to me still a really terrible way of describing what they're dealing with. But anyway, so I was involved in this project, and the funding call that kind of funded that big project, the people that were running that were they were happy with the projects that they commissioned, but they felt that there were some gaps. And so they put out a kind of call for a whole bunch of gaps, saying like, we'd really be interested in having another project about X, Y, and Z. And one of the areas that they were really interested in were projects that were looking at kind of the challenges of using art-based methods within mental health research. Okay. So the basic premise here was, on the one hand, loads of people are using art-based practices. The kind of doctors think they're great. There's loads and loads of practice. But when you talk to researchers about it, quite often you'll get the kind of, the people I call the people in lab coats, but, they're sort of the medical practitioners, and also a lot of social scientists will sort of say, well, if it really works, how are you proving? How are you measuring it's doing? And then you get a lot of kind of archetypes like me saying, I used to don't understand the beauty of what we do. You don't understand me or my music. And I kind of thought that it would be really good, or we thought collectively, it would be really good to do a project which actually went beyond that. Said, look, sorry, if this is of value, explain to me why it's useful. Explain to me how we can measure it. And then at the same time, from a kind of arts side, of saying, well, look, okay, well, clearly the way you're wanting us to measure doesn't work for us. So how can we make it more effective? So actually trying to have a genuine conversation that can overcome some of the barriers to make the most of this stuff that we know is useful, because people can see that it's useful, right? So we kind of come up with a project that's looking at a number of different barriers to more effective uses of art-based practices in mental health research. The first barrier was like understanding, like having a shared language, understanding what we mean by things like research, or what we mean by mental health or well-being or all that sort of stuff. Then we wanted to look at the way art plays out in these projects. So quite often what's very interesting about the use of arts-based practices in mental health research is the art is kind of largely ignored. The reason why particularly young people want to get involved in this stuff is often because they want to make a film or they want to kind of produce a piece of music or whatever. But in the research, people are more focused on kind of doing a questionnaire at the start, saying, how do you feel now? You do the art, then a questionnaire at the end, how do you feel now? And they kind of ignore the stuff in the middle. So we were interested in that. And then we were interested in looking at kind of the mechanisms of change, what happens in arts-based practice and how we can really pin that down and do some really useful work to think about, like, you know, what does it mean to be involved in a photography project or in a drawing project? How do different arts engage young people in different ways, and how can that support their mental health? And that was the work stream that you were involved in, Chris. And then we've got a final work stream looking at standard measure. Like, there's a lot of discussion around where you know, if you want to show some change, you need to use one of these standard measures that everyone understands about. And a lot of arts people saying, well, that, yeah, but they don't really work, or maybe there's ways in which we can use the arts to make that more effective. So that's so we came up with these 4 things that we really wanted to explore, and we're kind of working through them at the moment, doing lots of different things, working with young people, with a whole range of academics, and with arts practitioners to try to come up with more effective ways of making the most of the arts in this particular context. And the way we're doing that, the key case study that we're using to explore all this stuff and to generate the art, and also to generate the engagement with the young people that we're working with, is the topic of loneliness. This was also identified as an area that they wanted to have some more work on. So they kind of said, you know, do that. So we said we would do this art-based practice piece and also look at that, what that means for loneliness. And the way we're dealing with that is through a youth engagement program that is being led by Danelle. So over to you, Danelle.
Yeah, so I'm looking after a main group of young people, which we called our Young Persons Advisory Group, so YPAG for short. A lot of the projects that we're doing couldn't actually exist without the young people. So one of the underlying premises that we're working towards, I wouldn't say it was perfect, it's a constant work in process, is a sort of co-productive, almost equal relationship with the young people, where they have a lot of insight and information and input into how we work with them, where we go with the project, what interests them. And so one of the things that really does interest them and why they've come on board with the project is this idea of loneliness and making a difference as young people. So they really want to connect with young people far and wide, and help create a community that helps combat loneliness within young people. And they want to do that through a few different ways. One is by sharing artwork they've created, whether it's films, whether it's reels, whether it's photographs or drawings, paintings, any manner of thing, and through signposting. So anything that signifying, you know, 5 tips on do X, Y, and Z, you know, celebrating Mental Health Day, Youth Awareness Day. And they're doing this proactively in 2 different ways. One, they've very recently launched their own podcast called the Not So Alone podcast, or Not.So Alone podcast. And then the second way is through an Instagram account. And that's where you'll see a lot of the artwork that they've created on there, poetry, films of them talking about their own experiences of, for example, recently going to university or going to a new school or starting a new school year, and them talking about their experience. The podcast is very much looking at all different issues that are affecting young people at the moment and coming at it from a very mental health, loneliness, isolation, you know, covering those sorts of topics. And it's absolutely fascinating listening to what they have to say. As much as we think we know what's going on with young people, we really don't know what it's like to be a young person in today's age. So if, you know, listen to their 2 most recent podcasts, the first one was on just how to make friends. It's a completely different landscape for how young people make friends now, and the challenges that are involved and inherent with all of that. And then the second one was how social media can play a role in bringing young people together and connecting, but also helping them feel even more isolated and even more alone. And it's they're running it. I'm supporting them and helping facilitate the actual event, but they themselves are asking all the questions and talking to each other. So it's very much led by them. And that's one of the reasons why they've joined this project. They've joined the Create project, is because they want to make a difference. And they're really passionate about making a difference. So it's giving them that platform to be able to do that.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that was one of the things that struck me when we, I think it's worth saying for people listening that I came to one of the live-in labs that you guys ran. Was that right?
Yeah.
Over a course of a weekend, there were a series of creative activities. We had art, we had photography, which I was facilitating, and then we had filmmaking. And we sort of had a weekend. It was a really sort of intense, condensed process of kind of research, reflection, participation, and going through that a creative process. And I really loved the fact that it was, because you said about it being co-produced, but then also that's kind of like tricky and messy and complicated and doesn't always go in the direct. But for me, that's the work, isn't it? You know, whenever I hear people say, "Oh, we co-produced that," and I'm like, "Did you really?" Because it all looks like it's you doing it all. This is too smooth sailing to be something that's co-produced, because co-production is messy and complicated and slightly not really sure what's going to happen next. But that's the sign of it actually happening. So I really loved that, and I loved how the young people themselves were co-researchers. So in that, if I think about the activity that I was involved in, which was to do a photo voice activity over the course of 2 days, with regular kind of breakout reflective opportunities where the young people supported by researchers were kind of really stepping outside of the process, thinking about how they felt in that moment, thinking about what was were there any shifts going on, or how did they feel about it. It was really interesting to see that kind of play out in real time as well, stepping outside of the process, because like you said, Paul, those kinds of questionnaires that, we've been presented with enough evaluation frameworks in the past. I won't name any, but there's enough of them out there where you're like, really? Like, you want us to ask this and then get into some sort of creative activity? Like, it already puts a barrier in, doesn't it? Rather than let's go through a process together, and then while we're doing it, while we're flying the plane, we'll kind of press pause and sort of, okay, well, what was it about that made it interesting? Or did you notice anything about the conversations that we were having, or how you were feeling in that moment? And let's think about that together as a way of demonstrating, what change is going on, what processes at work while we do this.
That's a real challenge as well, I think, in terms of the art and health space, because obviously if somebody's ill and they go to see a physician or they go to see a psychologist or whatever about it, that psychologist needs to know what the problem is, and they need to work out how they're going to do something. So doing a questionnaire to sort of find out, to kind of find out where we're all starting from, makes perfect sense. The problem is when you do this kind of more kind of community arts type stuff, to facilitate, you might be going into an arts and health space, but you're not really going in as a physician. You're going in as somebody to kind of facilitate and work with the community. So you might be working with people that somebody else has said, well, this is a population that we're probably going to be suffering from X, Y, and Z. But the people themselves might not either want to talk about that or recognize it or whatever. So trying to use questionnaires in that context is really, really difficult. And you've also got to think about the ethics of it, etc. So they're the kinds of issues that we're really, really sort of like trying to think through in this stuff, and think about what are the opportunities to enhance mental health research and mental health practice using the art, rather than seeing it somehow kind of like trying to trick people into revealing things that they might not want to reveal.
I feel like it's a sort of square peg in a round hole, really, sort of trying to medicalize outcomes from creativity. I'm interested just in terms of the Project Create. I mean, are there any things coming out of that have sort of surprised you? Any findings or experiences or things that you're noticing coming out of the conversations with the young people?
Danelle, do you want to talk a bit about the young people? And then I'll talk a bit about the output.
So what's really interesting for Project Create, and we use this term young people, but we're assuming we all know what we mean when we say young people. There's like that general, and actually it's not. So the age demographic that Create works with and young people is actually classed as 10 to 24.
Okay.
So we're working with a huge spectrum. Like the life changes from a 10-year-old to a 24-year-old are quite different.
Yeah.
And when I first received the brief, when I first came on board with the project, I recognized that straight away. Both because how do you engage with such a wide group of young people, connect with them, and enable all of them to feel some equal sense of participation and voice, and to be able to facilitate all of that. So for me, that was quite a fascinating insight into how I guess this research world. I've not come at this from a research area. I've come at it from a project manager, a teacher, and an artist myself. So I've kind of come at this going, well, that's very interesting. You just want to engage with a large group of young people that you're classing as young people, but are you aware of like the different ways you might need to engage with them to get the insight that you're required? So I decided early on to split them sort of down the middle. Ideally, I would have done 3 groups, but because I'm the only one leading it, I had to sort of work within my own capacity. So I split them down the middle, and I've got one younger group who are 10 to 17. And then obviously looking at the safeguarding issues, I had the 18 to 24-year-olds. And then I saw like a maximum of 12 in each group. Because they're all spaced out across the whole of the UK, a lot of engagement is online, apart from once every quarter, we all come together into the 2-day living lab that you were a part of. So that's something to consider when you're working with young people in research, and you do work with that entire demographic, obviously from children, but up until 24 years old. It's recognizing that there are going to be slightly different ways of engaging. Older young people are probably going to be more likely to be more articulate and might dominate a conversation more. So making sure that you've got equal space to enable everybody to feel like they can communicate. And sometimes they might speak, and sometimes it's giving them the opportunity to write in a notebook, because that's the better way for everybody to have that time for them to be able to gather their own thoughts and then be able to share them. But also, not everybody likes speaking in a group. So some of the things I'm learning is how to ensure that everybody has an opportunity to say what they want to say in a way that is comfortable for them. So I'd say that's one of the biggest learnings, and something you sort of know, but we then had to put that into practice and make sure that was a fundamental and real part of every engagement activity that we have with the participants. So that was probably one of the big things that came out of it. I don't know, Paul, anything else that you can think of?
Yeah, there's so much stuff that's come out of it, really. Just at the moment, I'm working, so you're talking about other things coming out. So there's going to be a whole bunch of academic papers coming out. And we're also going to produce kind of sort of practical how-to guide, I suppose, in terms of doing this, picking up on the sort of thing that Danelle has been talking about. But one of the really fascinating things that's really stuck with me, I think, came from our first living lab. So we sort of came up with all these different words that are potentially problematic if you're doing this kind of research, because there's a real sense of a breadth of understanding what these words mean. And then there are other words that certainly I didn't think would be that problematic. And one of the really interesting words was research, right? I thought, well, everyone knows what that means, right? And it was absolutely fascinating as we discussed what research meant. So across the academic, there was massive difference between what the very notion of what we are doing when we are doing research. And just to characterize it, this is a mischaracterization or a simplification of what actually happens. There's loads of different subject or positions between these two poles. But on the one hand, you had kind of like people like me, I suppose, who see research as a form of critical inquiry, which is about trying to open up new possibilities, try to push the conversation forward, try to challenge received opinions in order to take things forward. But what I don't ever do is come up with an answer, right? It's always about kind of like, well, yeah, but that question, no, that's not really the right question, more like this. And I think that's reasonably typical of kind of arts-based practice. Quite often what we're trying to do is we're trying to kind of problematize the terms of engagement to actually make people think anew about something. By thinking about something differently, you create something new, which is never going to be definitive. It's always just going to be the next step in the kind of iterative process of knowledge creating, if you like. Whereas colleagues on the clinical side and also on the social sciences side, they're sort of like, well, no, I mean, what we're trying to do is find the answer to a question. So it's about kind of pinning down your methodology, a methodology that can then be repeated in order to prove what you're doing is valid, in order to solve a problem. I mean, this is, again, it's a simplification, but there's definitely this difference, right? And then we went in to work with the young people, and we were trying to get them to reflect on what does research mean, right? And we were using music for this. And for me, it was absolutely fascinating, the way they decided to use music. Because we're going in and we're being all really nice. It's all about co-production and we want to listen to you and blah, 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 and all this sort of stuff. And, and we mean it. And in some ways, what happened proves that we mean it, right? And the feedback we got from the young people was really good. It's kind of like, well, you didn't tell us what to think. And it's really good because quite often in co-production, we're kind of given pointers, right?
Yeah.
And we don't want to do that. And what we found was there was one group that made this really scary, sinister piece of sort of like goth, sort of like dance, trance type music. And it was a bit like, oh my God, what's this? And I thought this was going to be kind of like, trauma.
Oh, I'm in. That's up my street. I'll be there.
Death trance.
Goth trance.
Yeah. So what was basically happening though is they were telling us that the word they were talking about was research, and this is what research meant to them. Research meant to them is they are kind of being experimented on.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I mean, it's just fascinating, and the music drew that out and really clarified it. So for me, that's been a really interesting thing. See how the process, I suppose, really does work.
Yeah. And it really strikes a chord with me that sort of critical conscious piece, because I sort of try to embed that in the work that I do, really, with it. The whole thing is just an ongoing process of exploring sort of like, who am I in this moment? What are things going on around me in this moment? How do I feel about that? What does it look like for me? And I always say to people, sort of frustratingly, I think sometimes, that, I'm the bringer of more questions. If there's an answer, then we missed something somewhere along the way, because that would assume that we're going to arrive at a point where we don't need to question anything ever again. And I'm not sure we're ever going to reach that stage.
But if you're trying to do a kind of clinical intervention where you've got a certain amount of money, you've got to do you totally got to do that. I mean, and for me, but it's kind of like, this is a completely different way of thinking about what research is. Context specific, I guess, isn't it? And I suppose for me, we're to me, that's like one of the tensions, isn't it, around this sort of whole concept of creative health, really, is that there's the two sort of worlds colliding almost. And I find it sort of fascinating, but also slightly worrying as well, all at the same time, how, there's the National Centre for Creative Health now, but they put some posters out recently that was like, if you do salsa dancing, you're sort of X% less likely to have, this condition or whatever. And I always feel like, okay, maybe I get that, but isn't that really sort of like condensing it down into, it's only of value to the extent which, it makes your leg feel better or makes your head hurt less, and I always feel like it's a bit kind of like minimizing, or I wondered what your thoughts were on that. I find it a little bit frustrating, really, because I feel like the benefits of being involved in creativity and alongside other people are many and varied, of which the physical side might just be one part of it. There's a whole social, emotional side of it. I completely agree with that. But I think in terms of our work, what's been interesting is actually trying to kind of pin down stuff, purely because actually what you tend to get in some research is kind of like, you got this problem, so we'll just throw creativity at it. We'll do a creative thing, and then at the end of it, we'll see what happens. And it's kind of, well, what do you mean by creativity, or what kind of like, what is the most effective form of creative practice? And I've also been in projects where, we want to get film, we want filming, that'd be great. And then you get involved in this project, and actually when you're there, you realize, or afterwards, when you produce the stuff that they wanted you to produce, we don't want that at all. And it's kind of, well, clearly the way, what we found out in the Living Lab that you were in is quite clearly there are different, doing different types of art impacts you in different ways and can make you feel differently, and it's not absolute, it's not kind of like you're saying, if you do this, this is going to improve, your mental health by 7% or whatever it is. But it's kind of like, so for example, we found that drawing seems to impact on people's kind of sense of mood or whatever in a different way to making film. So making film was much more frenetic. It was much more kind of like community oriented and much more kind of pressurized in a way. But for those people involved, they were people that wanted the pressure. They kind of liked the fact that they had to produce something really quickly. Whereas the people doing the arts were very much kind of like, you could see that they really enjoyed being introspective collectively. That was a really interesting thing that emerged from it, And then also there was loads, there was a bit of that going on. In some ways, it was kind of your workshop seemed to be in the middle of that a little
bit of both.
There was kind of collectivity, but also there was a sense of introspection. So for me, knowing that stuff is really good because it kind of helps to understand that there's different, it's horses for courses, as it were.
Yeah.
And so it can be useful, but that doesn't take anything away from the fact that clearly you can't reduce it to that. It's just kind of like, if you're interested in, this is the thing that you want to look at, well, maybe you should think more about doing art than doing filmmaking or whatever. And actually getting people to think about it a bit more kind of like carefully, I think is no bad thing. To think about the affordances of different art in different situations, which hopefully makes the art more rather than less fun. That's what we hope to see anyway. What do you think, Danelle?
Well, I think we're experiencing the same tensions, though, aren't we? And you talked about it earlier on in terms of reducing the art or the impact or the output that that the art has on the young person into, they feel X% better.
Yeah.
And it's a hierarchy, isn't it, that happens in the research and academic sphere of numbers, and statistics seem to be and have more credibility than creativity and art form, because it can't be. I guess what they're doing with that, they're doing two things, I guess, is turning it into a commodity. So it's something that can be sold by, taking or doing this so many times a week is going to make you feel X amount better.
Yeah.
And then that's how you sell it. You've got that obvious X equals Y, and we'll have that benefit. But the reality that we all know when we participate in art form is that it will always be quite unique to the individual, to that experience, to that moment. We know that there is, it's going to help in some way.
Yeah.
It's not a universal tool, but there is some universal acknowledgement. You look at COVID and they're saying, do art, do creativity, will make you feel better. But they don't seem to be prepared to share the mantle of that creativity, non-quantifiable output with the statistics and the numbers and the theory of science, I suppose. And we're experiencing the same tension. It's quite interesting because we are working transdisciplinary, so we're working with social scientists and arts facilitators and young people, and especially with the social scientists and with the arts practitioners, the way they're coming at the project is from those two different perspectives. It's from the art going, no, we know art, we know it doesn't, we don't know why we have to quantify it. And then you've got the scientist going, no, we need to quantify it. The answer to the question. So it's that kind of needing to have the answer to the question rather than just that. Actually, let's sit with the question. Let's just explore the question.
Yeah.
It's all right if we don't have an answer to it. And that there's real tension there, and it's not superficial tension. It's a real tension, and it's obviously one that we can see wider in the conversation around, I guess, creative health or healthcare, mental health. All of that is let's sit in the messiness because everyone's trying to tidy it up.
But what's really fascinating is that, genuinely Create's been one of the most fascinating projects I've ever been involved in, without a doubt, because it's hard work, because you are constantly having that conversation, that kind of transdisciplinary conversation. And it's brilliant because everyone's heart's in the right place, right? Everybody wants to try and figure this out, but there are no wallflowers in the team, right? And everybody, all the young people, all the academics involved, arts practitioners, all know what they think, but they're always willing to kind of listen and have empathy with the position of other people. So it's really fascinating because it's the sort of project, when we first started it, I was thinking, this is nuts. And even writing it was hard. Writing it was the same process. People would sort of say, well, you sort of get so far and then you think, just don't understand what we're doing, really. And people will people would explain what they're doing, and I'd have to write it down because I was putting in the bids there. And it's like, well, this isn't what I said at all, and that it's been that process, but it's been really fascinating. And I think, I don't think we haven't come up with sort of the agreed set of this is what X, Y, and Z means, but I think it's made everybody reflect upon their practice and can understand how their practice relates to other people's practices. And I think in some ways that's the best that we can hope for.
Well, there's a saying that I always used to use when I was in my community development sort of training days, is that, the sort of, the method is the message, or the medium is the message.
Yeah.
So kind of like practice what you preach. Do you know what I mean? It's like, you can't be sitting with the messiness. I like that, Danelle. Especially if you take a look around my studio, I'm living that motif as I speak. But it's kind of like, it would be counterintuitive for you to be doing all this so that you could arrive at some definitive kind of answer, because it's kind of like, well, what I kind of guess what we're saying is that there isn't one. We're not going to arrive at a magic formula that's going to give all the kind of social scientists and medical bods out there, a formula for prescribing creativity to someone. Like, it's not going to work like that. But actually being in the process alongside people while we explore these things kind of opens up that conversation.
Yeah.
And there's so many similarities to the community development world within that, where there's a great video, which, if you've not seen it, I think it's worth having a look at. It's the parable of the blobs and squares. I think it's narrated by Brian Blessed as well, which is just like a little extra bonus. But it's that tension between the sort of institutional world and then the community space, and the tendency of organizations and formal stuff to try and make everything kind of look the same, fit the same shape, kind of become a bit more square, and the blobs kind of resisting that, right? And so it's kind of, how do you find a way of acknowledging and accepting that we need institutions for stuff, but we need messy, blobby, squishy, community, creative stuff too. And the challenge is, how do they sit alongside each other without one, co-opting the other?
Well, that's the important point, though, isn't it? Because you do need both. You need squares and you need blobs.
Yeah. It's not an either or.
Yeah. I like that.
I always used to say to people, if I get on a plane or a train, I don't want to co-produce flight. Get the post-it notes out, and anybody flown a plane before, and what skills do we have on? Happy to outsource that to someone who knows how to drive the train or the plane. But it doesn't mean that's how I want to receive all of the kind of other parts of my life.
Yeah, and I think the interesting. I also think that the approaches that we bring are kind of helpful with regard to. So it's not about kind of coming up with a one-size-fits-all kind of toolkit or whatever, but it's also understanding that if you make a film, it's different from taking a picture. It's different from doing some music.
Yeah.
And actually thinking about it in those terms, and then generally thinking about, well, what is it you're trying to achieve? And then thinking about what might be the best kinds of creative practice to use, or like how could they work together? So it's about trying to kind of think about what goes on, because different stuff does go on in different types of workshops.
Yeah.
But quite often people, in the literature, people don't really explore the kind of specific affordances of different types of art. So for me, it's very much about, actually, well, if you think about that, that's going to open up different questions in different ways. And for me, that totally kind of fits in with my approach to research. It's not about closing stuff down. It's just about saying, well, so I'm making a film, and actually, if we do that, that's different to drawing some pictures, because you've got to do different things, and that's going to then potentially impact the outcomes of the project and blah blah blah. And when you look at the literature, the literature doesn't really talk about it in those terms. It just sort of lumps creative practice sort of together a bit, really. So I sort of think that differentiating it's not about sort of saying, if you want to do X, you need to do Y, but it's about sort of saying, well, if you want to do Y, do you think X is the best route? Might be, but this is what's going to happen if you do that. So what about this? So it's about kind of trying to bring a more kind of artsy, opening up questions approach to doing social sciencey mental health research. I think that's what I think is going on anyway.
Yeah, I love that, and I guess it speaks to what you said, Danelle, as well, isn't it? About what I'm hearing you both say is that you're reflecting on the sort of terminologies used, whether that's terms like young people. What is this? Some sort of homogenizing category where, like, what does that really mean? Who do we mean? Where do we mean? What do we mean? And then arts and creativity. So it's like, let's get specific about the who, the what, and the where, and the why. I like that.
There's also something we haven't talked about, and something that's come out recently, especially in the most recent question, which is like the mechanisms of change. And actually, the second one as well is the difference to when young people do it on their own. They're doing that, they're engaging in that work practice by themselves, as opposed to when they're doing it in a group. And I don't know that there is a huge amount of literature or work that's actually been done that's explored that, but it is quite different. It is quite significant. And if you're wanting to look at community and connection and building confidence and maybe alleviating anxiety and all that sort of stuff, it's amazing how, and I don't think we've intentionally gone into these workshops going, there's a distinction between working with a young person one-on-one to working with a group of young people. We've just sort of always gone down the group of young people route. But that's been fascinating because they've really engaged in group work. And very recently, I ran a regional workshop in Cornwall where young people have, I guess, and this is where you need to look at the young people that you're working with, looking at the inclusion needs and whether you are setting up an environment that supports them to engage with what it is that you're creating, is that where they do have, say, extensive either intellectual disabilities or emotional supports, or they've got autism or they're sitting on the spectrum, sometimes working in a group is absolutely not going to work. And if you are going to be doing this kind of group work, is making sure that, and Paul touched on this earlier, is what is going to be the right thing for the group that you're working with or for the individual that you're working with. And just to make sure that you're not going in with that, well, I know that music is really good for this and you will engage in music and it will make you feel better. So making sure you're having those conversations with the young people to go, what's your area of interest? What is it that you like doing? And then work from what they know, where their strengths lie, and then building in any challenges on top of that.
I was really struck actually when I met, I know I only met a small part of the young people sort of that are involved within Project Create, but the group that I worked with, I was definitely struck by how supportive of each other they were throughout the process, and comfortable with each other enough to know sort of when someone was kind of feeling it and when things were getting a bit tense. Because we, in the work I do and the work that you are exploring, it's emotional, it's in the kind of space of feelings, we're asking people to kind of share stuff, and that requires a kind of sort of level of trust and a level of kind of shared kind of ownership and looking out for each other, and that really stood out for me. You could tell that people had sort of built a relationship, built friendships, built that kind of trust that was there. And again, it's just it's a huge part of it, isn't it? You can't dive into a kind of reflective kind of practice without building up, relationships and trust first. Without that, you're only ever going to go surface level, really.
I mean, that's one of the real privileges I think we've had with Create. Precisely that. We've had time and we've got a group of people, and some of the people were also involved in the Attune project that I mentioned before. So we've got a group of people that really do know each other. And it's really interesting because, we all know that sometimes projects aren't like that and it's a bit kind of in and out. And what do you always get in the feedback? It's like, we needed more time. We needed to build up a relationship. Well, it's been brilliant. And the one thing will be, what do we do at the end of this project thing, really? And how do we kind of like provide support, or, do we need to do anything to help them continue their relationships?
Yeah, I mean, so where is Project Create in terms of if it's on a cycle, if it's actually on one? I mean, is there an end point, or is this something that's got a finite kind of point in time where you're like, right, okay, we've kind of explored as much as we can, and so where are you on that track?
Well, technically 3/4 of the way through, right, Danelle? So we've done.
Yeah, and also, there's no way, like, this project is huge. I think we need like another 10 years to fully get into everything that's sort of come out of this project. But we've got 1 year left.
Yeah.
So it's crazy how quickly it's gone by. And for the YPAD, especially, so the next Living Lab, which is in February, is probably meant to be the last time that we come together for the research aspect of the project. But I really do think that for the young people and what they need, there needs to be another face-to-face, which will probably happen next June, which will be just very much focused on them and their campaign. And then there'll be a final, I guess, celebration event where we'll disseminate all the work that we've done in the project. And that'll be a conference that'll probably be held at the beginning of September.
Yeah.
So yeah, that'll be it. That'll be our sort of final engagement with the young people. And then it'll be just like tying up all the loose ends and making sure that everything as far as we can get it. But yeah, one year left.
Wow. But it's still, it's not a small amount of time, is it? There's, like you say, that given that you've had time to establish those relationships and the work in practice together, it's still quite a lot to be explored.
Yeah, and there's also, yeah, absolutely. And also, the good thing about a good thing about Create and Attune, actually, is that these are platforms. There's lots of people involved in these projects and loads of stuff emerges. And the way it works is really kind of like if the team have got ideas how they want to develop it, well, they can go and develop it. We're not bosses. We're just kind of providing the platform for people. So there's already ideas emerging for future projects that will build on this. I'm working with some of the young people or not, or whatever. So I'm hoping that this really is the sort of starting point for something that can be, obviously the current financial situation isn't brilliant in terms of funding. But the ideas are certainly there, and the wish to continue is certainly there.
Fantastic. So if anybody was wanting to find out more about the work you're doing, Project Create, how might they go about doing that?
Well, they would go to the website and they would go to social media, and Danelle knows exactly where all that stuff is.
Create.leeds.ac.uk. So that's going to give you a lot of the information and technicalities about the background of the project and some of the workshops and the findings that have been coming out. So that'll be a resource that'll be here and will be updated and will soon look amazing. And then, please go on to the socials, go on to the Not So Alone campaign on Instagram, and also go to Spotify and listen to the Not So Alone podcast, because it's amazing. And the great thing as well is the campaigns especially are run by young people for young people. So we want to hear from young people. And we also want to put out the invitation to any young people aged between 10 or 24 who would like to come on the podcast and talk about topics that are interesting to them. Like what does the world need to know about what is going on for young people right now? And whatever that now is, let's have that conversation, because that's what it's about. It's about creating that community, because we want, or they want, young people to realise that they're not so alone.
Love it. So, I'll put links to all of that in the show notes, so people can have a look. And I just want to say a big thank you to you both for sharing your time and your experiences. And it's been really lovely to have this conversation. Thank you.
Brilliant.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having us.